Before I begin, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which each of us gather this evening, for me being the Bund people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. In nomen von dem Bund will ich anerkennen die traditionelle Abhitel von dem Land, wo wir treffen sich heint in Abend, das Bundverang-Volk von dem Kulin-Volk, und wir geben ab Covid sehre Imes und Aves von dem Avel, von dem Asid und Zukünftige. My name is Dvora Zylberman, and it gives me great pleasure to speak to you this evening about the brilliant yet largely forgotten hero, Herman Kruk. I will just quickly note before we begin that if you do have questions throughout this evening, please post them to me in the chat, and we will have some time at the end at which I can hopefully answer as many questions as possible. There's an old saying that goes, history is written by the victors, and this has often been proven to be true. Recording history is never that simple, and the factor of the matter is that despite history being written by the victors, this doesn't always mean that history is recorded without bias and without agenda. And this issue is exemplified by the story of Herman Kruk. I suspect that many of you joining this evening won't yet know his name, or at least will know his name, but not who he was. Was he a Nobel Prize winner? No. Was he a politician? No. Was he a painter? No, though he did study photography. Herman Kruk was a hero who has been part of what is arguably a masterful editing of the history of the Vilna Ghetto. Born in Plock in Poland, Herman Kruk was first named Baruch Hersh. It can actually be no coincidence that Kruk was born in 1897, the year of the founding of the Jewish Labour Bund in Vilna, which is where he would find himself many years later. As a child, like many others of that time, he went to a religious elementary school, and, much like others at the time, he turned to more political ideas. He was actually initially involved in the Communist Party, but by 1920, Kruk was a passionate Bundist who settled in Warsaw. There, he became the director of the Grosse Library, the largest Jewish lending library, and was the most highly regarded Jewish librarian in pre-war Poland. As a Bundist, Kruk held a fundamental belief that books served as a means through which workers could elevate themselves, and saw them as an invaluable tool in the fight for democratic socialism. He was a frequent contributor to the Bund's Volkszeitung, the Jugendwecker, and Wochenschrift für Literatur. He also published pamphlets, including Rekommendierregimes, von Lektur auf die Themes, and Antisemitism. When World War II broke out in September 1939, Herman had a very heartbreaking decision to make, which was to leave his wife Paulina and his son behind in Warsaw, and he fled, eventually finding himself in Vilna. Kruk obviously struggled with this decision, but decided to leave Paulina in Warsaw as he assumed he would be quickly conscripted to the Polish army in Vilna and didn't want to leave her alone in a new city. Kruk was already maintaining a diary when he left for Vilna, documenting the incredibly fraught journey and the chaverim that he encountered along the way. Upon arriving in Vilna, one would think that his first stop would be maybe a fresh change of clothes, perhaps finding somewhere to stay. Not Herman Kruk. Kruk's first point of business was to go to the famous Strassen Library and to the YIVO building. Such was his dedication to Jewish culture. Before even finding somewhere to stay, he went to study the library catalogues. It's interesting to note that there was actually 2 points at which Herman Kruk had the chance to escape fate. The first happened before the ghetto was even established. His brother Pinchas and him were actually granted US visas in 1940, thanks to the Jewish Labor Committee in New York. Pinchas left Europe, but Herman was so focused on locating his wife and son in Warsaw, and his continuous delayed departure meant that he became stuck in 1940 when the Soviets annexed Lithuania. He was given the chance to leave, but only if he agreed to be a Soviet agent, but he refused. This decision is a true reflection of the personality of this man. Herman was known as a man of deep integrity who was incredibly well respected. He was considered refined, a man who stood tall, who remained committed to his principles, even if it meant not leaving Vilna. With the eventual Nazi takeover of Vilna in 1941, Kruk found himself a prisoner of the Vilna Ghetto. He was actually appointed the director of the Ghetto Library. The story behind this speaks to his character. A Bundist who happened to be a member of the Judenrat saw Kruk sorting through the mud one day, trying to rescue books from the wallow. He shared what he had seen to the Judenrat, and Kruk was asked to direct the library the following day. Together with his chosen team of Zelik Kalmanovich, who had worked at the YIVO, Chaiko Lunsky, who had worked at the Strassen Library for many years, Bella Zachain, Dina Abramovich, who would later also work at the YIVO for many, many years in New York, Dr. Moshe Hillel, and others, he worked to keep the library both functioning and as orderly as possible. Amazingly, he was even able to establish library branches in the ghetto, such as in the school. And amazingly, so popular was the ghetto library that there was a celebration for the lending of the 100,000th book from the ghetto library. And here you can see a poster from that event. In his role as director, Herman Kruk took every opportunity to salvage and rescue books wherever he could find them. Kruk and Kalmanovich actually received permission to pursue several expeditions outside of the ghetto to the Strassen Library, the Cloys of the Vilna Gaon, and to the Great Synagogue of Vilna. These expeditions saw the two men rescue many Jewish cultural treasures and bring them back to the ghetto library. Almost unbelievably, Kruk received help from the ghetto administration to bring the inner walls of the Ark from the Great Shul, the memorial plaque from over the Vilna Gaon's seat in his cloys, and 3 clocks from the Schulhof, which were there to indicate prayer times, back into the ghetto. One might ask the question, why smuggle these rarities into the Vilna Ghetto? Surely they would be safer elsewhere. It wasn't easy to find reliable places to store these documents outside of the ghetto. The reality is the Jewish historical and cultural treasures were safest, ironically, amidst the chaos of the ghetto. Herman Kruk kept a meticulous record of daily Vilna Ghetto life in his personal journal. He recorded personal interactions with Chaverim, stories he had been told, observations of ghetto life, and more, including, amazingly, how they celebrated Yom Tovim in the ghetto, how May Day was celebrated, how they marked the 45th anniversary of the Bund in Vilna, and how they celebrated Pati Kremel's 76th birthday in the ghetto. One of the events listed in Kruk's diary took place on October 24th, 1941, the action of yellow papers. Only 3,500 yellow work permits were available at that time, along with pink papers for their family members, which equated to a partner and 2 children. This meant that with the yellow and pink papers combined, only 14,000 inhabitants of the ghetto would be protected from deportation. Herman Kruk, who had received a yellow work permit for his role as the ghetto library director, pretended to marry the Bundistke Pati Kremel, who at the time was in her 70s and was old enough to be his mother. Kruk also saved 2 orphan children by pretending that they were his own. Kruk recorded the popularity and the importance of the ghetto library in reports, in fact, yearly reports. So meticulous was Herman Kruk. His report from October 1942 recorded some interesting numbers. Firstly, there were 2,500 registered readers in the ghetto library. Of those 2,500 readers, 26.7% were under the age of 15 years old, and 36.7% were between 15 and 30 years of age. Their main genre of choice? Fiction, a chance to escape the ghetto and the harsh reality outside. In 1942, Kruk faced his biggest challenge, arguably. The Einsatzbereichsleiter Rosenberg, or ERR for short, was charged with taking Jewish cultural property for Judenforschung, the study of Jews. The aim of the ERR was to ship said property deemed valuable for Judenforschung to Berlin. However, it soon became clear that those working for the ERR did not have the linguistic or cultural expertise to interpret the value of their loot. The head of the ERR team in Vilna, Dr. Hans Muller, placed Herman Kruk in charge of the work group charged with sorting through the items collected. Kruk actually described the initial experience in his diary on February 19th, 1942. He wrote, "Kalmanovich and I don't know if we are grave diggers or saviors. If we succeed in keeping the treasure in Vilna, it could be our great service to some extent. But if they take the library away, we will have had a hand in it." The collections at the Strassen Library, the Unsky Museum, YIVO, and the Judaic Department at Vilnius University were seized and eventually moved to the YIVO building. Kruk's role granted him a permit to go in and out of the ghetto to collect documents. And most importantly, this permit allowed him to skip body checks at the ghetto gates. This in turn gave Kruk the chance to smuggle books and papers into the ghetto to save them from destruction. In April 1942, Kruk wrote, "The guards are amazed. I bring desks, tables, benches, cabinets, card catalogues, sleeping boards, etc., into the ghetto. The Jews in the ghetto are amazed at how I obtain them. And only a few know that I've got a special permission in my pocket. But no one knows that under the furniture, I'm smuggling a mass of books for the ghetto schools into the ghetto. An enormous number of old prints, rare books, very valuable paintings." These were hidden away in the ghetto library, and it's noted in the English translation of Herman Kruk's diary by Barbara Hauschav that in March 1942 on Purim, there was no Megillus Esther, Book of Esther, in the Vilna Ghetto, and it was the Bundist, Herman Kruk, who was able to lend scrolls from his hidden collection to the shulen in the ghetto. As the quota for the amount of books which could be sent to Germany became harsher and harsher, Kruk described the heartbreak of Jewish laborers being tasked with dumping books for destruction. The Jewish laborers who are engaged in this work are literally in tears. From the very beginning at the YIVO worksite, Herman Kruk was engaged in book smuggling, and in June 1942, as books and documents began to be destroyed, he enlisted the help of other members of the work brigade, which later became known as the Papill Brigade in the ghetto, the Paper Brigade. This name was given to them to make fun of them, as at a time when most people were smuggling food into the ghetto, they were smuggling papers. The great Yiddish poets Avrom Sutzkever and Shmerkel Kaczerginski played a central role in the smuggling and rescue of these documents, books, and artifacts. Herman wrote about the efforts in his diary. In November of 1942, when more books were brought to the work group at YIVO for sorting, this pack included the works of Sholem Aleichem and Yud Lamed Peretz, as well as Beryl Mark's History of Social Movements of Jews in Poland. Kruk wrote, "At my request, they have promised to let us take some books for the ghetto library. Meanwhile, we take them on our own." After the war, Sutzkever could recall 10 hiding spots where these cultural treasures were hidden, including one at Sik Shavel, which also happened to be where the FPO hid their weapons. In fact, Herman Kruk had a melina, a hiding space of his own for rarities of the ghetto library collection. In the picture below, you can see a map drawn of the hiding spot at 6 Shavelgas, and you can see that it's been annotated in the Yiddish. Just a quick note as well that it can be no coincidence that Patti Kremer lived above this melina at 6 Shavelgas. Kruk continued his heroic efforts in the Vilna Ghetto. He helped the FPO, the partisans, by creating a hiding spot for their weapons inside of the ghetto library. There was a secret hiding spot for guns behind a shelf with copies filled with Josephus's Jewish Wars, which detailed the Maccabees' uprising against the Syrian Greeks. Thus, through Herman's work, the ghetto library became a symbol of both cultural and armed resistance. He continued his efforts to archive ghetto life. Given cameras were forbidden in the ghetto, he led an initiative to form a group of young artists to draw pictures of life in the ghetto. When in March 1943, the ghetto chief and police chief questioned whether to liquidate the ghetto bookstore or to hide it, Herman helped to hide it. It's important to note the significance of this bookstore. From June 1942 to March 1943, a matter of months, 3,396 books were sold from that bookstore alone. I mentioned earlier that Kruk had the chance to escape fate twice. The second time came towards the end. Despite being healthy enough to consider the option of joining the partisans, as he was only 45 years old, he believed it was his role to stay and record the story of the Vilna Ghetto to its end. Kruk was sent to Estonia in September 1943. In fact, it was Herman Kruk who in August of the same year, sensing that they didn't have long, called for the ghetto archive to be buried. He continued writing in a diary he managed to steal from a storeroom in the Kluger camp, and also continued writing in Lagedi up until his murder on September 18th, 1944. The day before his death, Herman Kruk buried his diaries in front of 6 witnesses. It was later retrieved by Nissen Anolik, the only one of those 6 witnesses to survive. On the cover note of his buried diary, he wrote, "Neighbors in Camp Kluger often ask me, why do you write in such hard times? Why? And for whom? I know I am condemned and waiting my turn, although deep inside me burrows a hope for a miracle. Drunk on the pen, trembling on my hand, I record everything for future generations. A day will come when someone will find the leaves of horror I write and record." Thanks to Herman Kruk's cultural resistance in the Vilna Ghetto, several significant Jewish cultural treasures survived the Holocaust, including the record book of the Vilna Gaon synagogue, dating back to 1768, menorahs, manuscripts, and of course his diary. Many of the cultural and historical treasures which Kruk was able to save were later recovered by the likes of Kaczerginski and Sutzkever, and are currently part of a mass digitization project by YIVO in New York. His diary, which was found and published after the war, first in Yiddish and then in English, is one of the most comprehensive records of Vilna Ghetto life. We have insight into and knowledge of Ashkenazi Jewish life and tradition, which would have otherwise been lost, along with our 6 million brothers and sisters who were murdered at the hands of the Nazis. Despite all of Herman Kruk's work, he remains virtually unknown. In fact, even in the discussion of the history of the Papill Brigade, his own idea, which has only come to the surface relatively recently in Holocaust studies, Herman is often treated as a footnote. It's as if Kruk himself predicted this when he wrote in March 1943, "For the past week, I have tried to get in touch with the world. The world probably buried me long ago." Instead, the focus is on Kaczerginski and Sutzkever, both of whom survived the Holocaust and were able to smuggle a significant proportion of these documents to the YIVO in New York. You can actually see a picture here of the boxes of treasures that they managed to save, which were initially stored, interestingly, in the Manischewitz shipping container because there were so many boxes that they couldn't actually fit them in the YIVO building. It is largely thanks to the work of Dr. David Fishman, the preeminent scholar of the history of the Papill Brigade, as well as a small handful of other historians, that Herman Kruk is given his due credit. Why then is the man who Sutzkever himself referred to as the prophet of the ghetto and was the head of the Papill Brigade filed away in the archives of cultural resistance during the Holocaust and not at the forefront alongside the likes of Dr. Emanuel Ringelblum? The reality is, many historians pick and choose what suits their contention or their chosen area of interest. The problem with this is that such historians become editors of history. And this ultimately means that the influence of individuals and the details of events can become muddied in order to fit a chosen narrative. This is how people like Herman Kruk become forgotten, despite their significant contribution to the Jewish people. Thus, it is the responsibility of professional and committed scholars to call out the rewriting of history. It is through their standing as exemplary professionals that history can be told as accurately as possible. Moreover, it highlights to us the importance of telling our own stories. The Bund has been the focus of many books and scholarly papers, and we are often written about without adequate research. The amount of articles currently being written about the Bund without communicating with our organization or with members of our community is quite honestly absurd. Yet, there are those that feel perfectly comfortable writing our history without actually knowing our history. It is clear that it is up to us to share our collective memory. It is up to us to ensure that the truth is told. It is up to us to ensure that Bundisten like Herman Kruk are given their due place in the history books. In a note found with Herman Kruk's papers in the Vilna Ghetto, he pled, "I beg the honest discoverer to respect my wish, preserve the materials. If we do not, then who will? Kavod sein lichtigen Andenk." I would now like to open it up to the audience for any questions that you may have. Please type your name in the chat and your question, and I'll try and answer as many as possible, and I'll answer them as best I can. Ultimately, while people are sharing their questions in the chat, I'll just quickly give a plug for two books that are very important to read if you want to find out more about Herman Kruk, the first of which obviously is Herman Kruk's diary, and you can see how thick it is. When I said daily life in the ghetto and in the camps, I meant daily life because you can see just how thick it is. The original Yiddish is very, very hard to find, but you can find Barbara Harshav's translation, and it is called The Last Days of the Jerusalem of Lithuania. The second book that I encourage everyone to read is by Dr. David Fishman, and I apologize, you can see I've been reading it because I've tabbed it, but it is called The Book Smugglers, Partisans, Poets, and the Race to Save Jewish Treasures from the Nazis by Dr. David Fishman, another fantastic book. So I will open up to questions. If anyone has any, please type in the chat. No questions. I'll give a minute for any questions that people might want to type in. Just as a point, it's worth noting that when I referred to the action of yellow papers earlier, and I mentioned that only 14,000 lives would be saved by those yellow and pink papers, at the time we're talking about a total of approximately 32,000 people in total in the ghetto. So it would effectively almost halve the population of the ghetto, that deportation. So having one of those yellow papers or being able to save somebody's life with those yellow papers was a pretty important thing to do. So it doesn't seem like there are any questions. So again, I'll quickly give a plug for those two books I encourage you to read. And so that you can hear Herman Kruk's story in his own words. Again, his diary is The Last Days of the Jerusalem of Lithuania, and Barbara Harshav did the translation. And the second book was by Dr. David Fishman, who I mentioned earlier, The Book Smugglers. Again, a really fantastic read. I will now pass it. Oh, are there still books that were not found? Great question, Esther. Thank you for that. So there were books that were not able to be found, and certainly books that, when they were not found in good condition. So they weren't salvageable. In fact, actually, parts of Herman Kruk's diary were not salvageable. So when I mentioned before, for example, the action of yellow papers is documented in his diary, you can see the title, but the actual description is gone. So it's just a matter of the fact that they did not have, obviously, the resources to be able to archive these things properly in the ghetto. And so we're quite lucky that a lot of things survived, some didn't. They actually, despite sending most of the things into the ghetto to be stored, there were also things that were stored outside of the ghetto. So Herman Kruk actually made a deal, for example, with one particular non-Jewish professor from Vilnius University that was effectively along the lines of, I'll save your books if you save mine, because he was, I believe, a professor in communist studies, I want to say, and obviously they wanted to destroy those books. So Kruk saved those books for that professor, and that professor saved those, the Jewish books from the library. Did the Soviets move any of the books when Vilna was liberated? Great question. Yes, they did. So actually, the major reason why Shmelkel Kaczerginski and Avrom Sutzkever smuggled the books out of Vilna to the YIVO in New York is actually because of the Soviets. So the initial plan was to keep all of those treasures, and they started up a museum in Vilna with all of these treasured items that they managed to save. But because of the threat of the Soviet rule, which became tighter and tighter, and the fear that they were going to take and destroy these treasures, Shmelkel Kaczerginski and Avrom Sutzkever kind of became the Papill Brigade 2.0. So they then had to smuggle them again out of Vilna, this time to New York, and not all of the items managed to be saved. Some of the items were taken to a church in Vilna and were stored in that church, and the man who managed to keep them from being destroyed by the Soviets in that church was a librarian called Antonis Ulpis, who managed to keep those treasures a secret for many, many years, many decades, hidden in the basement of the church. And at the beginning of the 90s, these treasures were found. And that's a major component of what YIVO is currently working with in digitizing those documents. So included in there, for example, were there's an unknown manuscript from Chaim Grade, so a brand new book that I believe YIVO is planning on publishing that hasn't been read before. There were letters from Abba Kovnel. There were poems from Sutzkever. So there's quite a few special treasures in there as well. And all because of this brilliant idea that Herman Kruk had, which was we need to not just save people, but we need to actually save our culture. Okay, so I encourage you all to read more about Herman Kruk. He's a fascinating character. I didn't even get to cover everything that he does because that would just be 3 hours of your life. But you would find out more if you read his diary, which really is fascinating and actually mentions individuals that we hear about all the time, but from a personal perspective, like his relationship with Pati Kremel, for example, is just amazing to read about. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to pass it over to Daniel Goldberg just to share some finishing remarks. Daniel.
Thank you very much, Dvora. I'm sure everyone got a great deal out of your presentation and hopefully have learned a lot more about Herman Kruk tonight. So thanks everyone for being involved. I'm Daniel from the Bund as well, and just wanted to thank you all for coming and also to stay in contact with us. You can like us on Facebook, and it's facebook.com/Bund Melbourne. And you can also head to our website, bundist.org. And at bundist.org, you can sign up to our newsletter, and you can also see all of our previous events that have been moved online because of COVID-19. And from there, you can also find a link to our YouTube channel. And you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. We've got lots of different videos and past events that we've uploaded there. And you can have a look through all of them and see what you think. So thank you very much, and a big chavashaf to everyone. Stay safe and hope you have a good evening. Thank you.
Chavashaf, everyone. Good evening.